Problem 36. If the solubility of sucrose in 100 milliliters of water is 204 grams at 20 degrees Celsius and 260 grams at 50 degrees Celsius, notice that at hotter temperatures you can dissolve more. Label each of the following solutions as unsaturated, saturated, or supersaturated. If more solid is added than can dissolve in the solvent, assume that undissolved solid remains at the bottom of the flask. So you got four mixtures right here. Now, before we look at these, let's just decipher what we see up here. The first sentence tells us how much sugar you can dissolve in 100 milliliters, and we see that you can dissolve 204 grams when it's 20 degrees and 260 grams when it's 50 degrees. So over here I've made my little notes. Let me blow this up just a little bit. So this problem concerns the solubility of sucrose in water. So at the colder temperature, it allows a maximum of, the solubility is 204 grams of sucrose in 100 milliliters of water. That's the maximum amount that can dissolve in 100 milliliters of water. Now, if it were only half the amount of water, then you can only add, put half the amount of sucrose in there. So hopefully that makes sense. And the reason I'm considering 50 milliliters of water is because that's in the problem too. So let's look at the hotter temperature. The hotter temperature, it says the solubility is 260 grams. It goes into 100 milliliters of water. So if it were 50 milliliters, that would be 130 grams could go in there. Okay, hotter temperatures, you can dissolve more. Now let's look at the four mixtures. The first one says you add 200 grams to 100 milliliters, and it's at 20 degrees Celsius. Now at 20 degrees Celsius, it fits a maximum of 204 in 100 milliliters. So if it's only 200 grams here, so if you're only putting 200 grams in 100 milliliters at 20 degrees, you're putting less than the maximum. So what it would look like, by the way, it would be clear, and that's because you haven't put more than the maximum. This is unsaturated. Okay, when you got the maximum, you call that saturated, but this is unsaturated because you could still dissolve 4 more grams if you wanted to. 204 is the solubility, but you only got 200. So I would say this is unsaturated. Now, the next one is at 50 degrees Celsius. At 50 degrees Celsius, so what does this say? If you've got 245 grams in 100 milliliters at 50 degrees, well, that's going to be unsaturated again, because at 50 degrees the solubility is 260 grams goes in 100 milliliters, but you only got 245. So again, you got less than the maximum. You could still dissolve 15 more grams in there if you wanted to. So you haven't reached the maximum. This is unsaturated. It would be clear again. So, mixture C. What about 110 grams in 50 milliliters at 20 degrees? Okay, so we're talking about 20 degrees and 50 milliliters. The maximum, the solubility is 102 grams will go in 50 milliliters. That's the max that you can put in there at 20 degrees. But this says, well, what if you got 110 grams in there in 50 milliliters? Well, it's not all going to go in. It's not all going to go in. What's going to happen is the the 8 grams extra that you got is going to eventually settle down to the bottom, forming a little pile. Okay, now the rest of the water we say is saturated, okay, because 102 grams went into the water, and then the 8 grams excess eventually settles down. So when you put too much stuff in there, the water is going to accept the maximum amount, and the rest of it will just settle down. So what's up here is a saturated solution, but the rest of it will settle down. Okay, that's what the bottom sentence, the second sentence, if more solid is added that can dissolve, assume that the undissolved solid remains at the bottom of the flask. There it is. Okay, the last mixture is mixture D. Mixture D says adding 220 grams to 100 milliliters of water at 50 degrees and slowly cooling to 20 degrees to give a clear solution with no precipitate. Okay, let's see what this is saying. You're adding 220 grams to 100 milliliters at 50 degrees. What will that go in? At 50 degrees, you can fit 260. So yeah, the 220 will go in. This will go in the water at 50 degrees. Now, when you have, well, what about when you have and right when you add it, I would say it's unsaturated, because you only put 220. You could have put 260 in, but you only put 220. So I would say at first it's unsaturated, but after you cool this down slowly to 20 degrees, this says it gives you a clear solution with no precipitate. This tells you it's still in solution. But look, at 20 degrees, you're only supposed to have 204 grams. But if you cool it down carefully enough, and you don't shake the beaker, the rest of the excess will stay in there. So this is how you make a super saturated solution. You're only supposed to fit 204 grams at 20 degrees, but if you dissolve this in hot water and you cool it down, it'll stay in solution. That 16 gram excess sugar remains dissolved. So you got more sugar than supposed to be in there. So we call this super saturated. Now, this is an unstable mixture. It's an unstable solution, and if you flick the beaker, or maybe if you had a stick in here, or some kind of, you scratch the wall, then that 16 grams excess sugar would come out of solution. You would form a crystal, and that's how you make rock candy.